Okay. Well, why don't we kick things off? Hopefully others will be able to log on as they're able to and share with us who they are and where they're logging in from. Welcome, everyone. I'm Carol Arvidsson, Director of Strategic Communications at BWF, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Jay Wilson, who is Senior VP of Strategic Communications. And we are really excited to be here today to talk with you about all those very, very critical steps that we need to think about and execute as we're getting ready to go public with a campaign. We're going to share presenting duties today. And I want to let you know that while we've allowed time at the very end of today's presentation for you to ask questions, please, if you do have questions along the way, use the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on that as we go through our time together, and we're happy to answer questions as we move along. So with that, I'd like to get us started with a poll. And if we can get the presentation to move forward, that would be great. Okay, here we go. So please participate in this poll. Our colleague Lauren, who's behind the scenes helping us out, she will definitely help run this for us. It's kind of fun to watch things coming along here as you're all answering. All right. Well, clearly slowly accelerating and getting up to speed is the winner so far here. Seems like that's where a lot of folks are. Looks like a few more people can weigh in here.
Okay, I think we have a winner.
Just about. Okay, this is great. Okay. Well, we'll keep going from here, but it definitely looks like most of you are beginning the process of getting up to speed. And hopefully some of the things we have to share with you today as we talk about that phase of the process will be beneficial to you. And hopefully for those of you who have veered off course, perhaps some of our comments today will help you definitely get back on course as well. All right. Jay, I think you're going to have to take over the driving of the slides. They're not advancing for me.
Okay.
So, okay. All right. Thank you. All right. No, oh, you can go back, please.
Too far. There we go.
Too far. Okay. So we're going to take this in steps and stages a little bit. And we want to talk about the things that you should be doing, 18 to 24 months out. And, I came across a quote while I was working on some of the things I wanted to share with you today. And I thought it was really appropriate for this kind of phase. And it's from Anatole France, French poet. And his comment was that to accomplish great things, we must not only act, but also dream, not only plan, but also believe. And it really feels like this part of the process is all about dreaming, certainly beginning to plan, and then believing that you're going to be successful. And so what are some of the things that you need to do to make sure that happens? Go ahead, Jay. All right. So there's certainly, some key questions as we're thinking about where exactly we're going. And go ahead, Jay. And so for your organization, this opportunity, to dream, to be bold, and to think big is really about reaching a new frontier, a new level for your organization. And that's certainly in many different aspects of your organization. But this really is the time to be visionary in your thinking. Go ahead. And there are certainly some key questions that need answering as you're doing this. And this is not just you as the communications team, but it's definitely in partnership with leadership, with the rest of the fundraising team, you want to be thinking about where your organization is headed. What is its aspirational state? If you're not going to stay in the status quo, then where are you headed? And this is, as you can tell, a time to dream about that. And why is that destination desirable and even needed? I mean, clearly, it's important to answer those questions. And then you need to answer the question about how the organization is going to get there. And certainly part of that answer involves philanthropy. Go ahead, Jay. And here, this part is so absolutely essential to everything else that follows. You absolutely have to get this part right. It's the foundation for everything else. You're going to build all of your work on this part of the process. So it is really, really important to get it right. Go ahead. So this is the point, of course, where you're developing the case for support and the communications plan. And the case, as you all know, this is the document that's going to provide the why, the inspiring vision about this new aspirational future state that you are headed toward as an organization. And it's going to provide and must provide the foundational messaging and editorial direction for all the other communications work that's going to come. In addition, as you're thinking about planning, this is where you really want to be thinking about who those key audiences are in the campaign. You need to identify them. You need to determine what they need to know, when they need to know it. You need to figure out those optimal channels and platforms to reach them, and the timing that is going to make the most sense so that you can continue to keep them engaged and motivated. Getting all of this right is essential for everything else that's to come. Go ahead. Now, we know from work in this area that there are things that can provide obstacles or pitfalls that really get in the way of this all being successful. And I think the biggest thing that happens seems to be having lack of a clear and compelling campaign vision. Sometimes there's a lot of vague ideas. There's, some things are decided, some things are yet to be decided, but not having, clarity around the whole reason to mount a campaign can really set you back. I've worked on projects where the case seemed to just continually change, changing ideas about what we're raising money for, or what we don't need to raise money for anymore, or not having things that coherently fit together. That can always be a challenge for communicators. Not having a fully developed communication plan definitely is one thing that can hamstring the team. You're not sure what you're doing, when you're doing it, why you're doing it. There's no sense of expectation of when things are going to happen. I mean, these are things that can also be truly obstacles. And then I think sometimes, as written here, you get yourself into a black hole and you start getting distracted by other things. And sometimes those other things come from leadership, giving you new things to focus on and new things to be engaged with. But getting off track makes it incredibly difficult to get back on track and actually gain some momentum around the important work that you're trying to do. So we've got some lessons learned that I think probably all of you can recognize these and even add to this list. But truly at this phase, you can't ever start early enough. And if you've been part of campaigns where things didn't get going soon enough, you know how difficult it is to either catch up or get ahead of things. Once you're behind, you're just behind. And you absolutely have to get the key people at the table from the get-go. That includes the decision makers, influencers, those you just need buy-in from. They have to be part of the process early on, or you're just going to have hiccups along the way. And you need to get the right details into the plan. I think it's okay to dust off your previous campaign communications plan, but ensure that your playbook is really updated for the times and you're not relying on old tried and true strategies and tactics when you really need to be operating in a modern campaign mode. So I want to give you an example of a client I've worked with that really got this part right. There's an organization here in the Twin Cities that for over 100 years has been a residential service provider to people living with intellectual and other disabilities. And as I said, they provide them with residential homes and apartments where they can live their lives to the fullest. That is their mission, to help them do so. And one of the things that this organization has identified more recently is that today people with disabilities, and in particular those with Down syndrome, are living longer. And in fact, by age 50, half of those with Down syndrome now are beginning to experience memory loss, other losses of skills that are all associated with Alzheimer's. This is new for this community. And many times these people are outliving their parents, who have typically been their primary caregivers. So even if they're living in a place like the residential apartments or homes that this organization provides, they can't continue to stay there because currently there aren't staff who can take care of them. The homes aren't equipped and prepared to provide the supports and services that these people need. So they're often returned to their homes where their parents can't care for them, or to nursing homes where, space is getting to be at a premium, and those staff members are not trained to deal with people who come with these very special needs. So this organization is jumping in and mounting a campaign so that they can raise $10 million to actually be able to care for their the people that they serve through their lifetime. So in other words, end of life care and aging well in their forever homes, but then also making sure they can attract and retain the staff, and make sure that those staff feel like they can make a lifetime career here, that they'll be compensated, and they'll have opportunities for training and career advancement. All these things really have to come together to make sure they can address this very important need in the community. And so for this organization, they got this right because they identified a need, they created a problem, they saw the problem, created a solution to solve it. They answered all those key questions I talked about at the beginning. They got all the right people on board from the get-go, made sure that people were buying in. They developed a compelling case and a communications plan that's going to guide all the messaging and calls to action throughout the life of the campaign. So they really did it right, and I applaud them for that. Okay, so now, once you finish this phase, it's on to the next 12 to 18 months. And your big overarching question in this phase is, go ahead, Jay, is, this is harder than it looks, isn't it? And I think for all of you who have done this before, you've probably said that to yourself or had a colleague say that to you. Go ahead, Jay. And so this phase really is all about how the campaign is going to feel, look, and sound. This is bringing it to life. Go ahead. And so by creating the visual language and the expanded editorial for the campaign, that's how you're going to bring it to life as you're working in this part of the campaign process. And it takes time to get all this right and to include all the moving parts. And by golly, we all know there are an awful lot of moving parts in this phase. And remember, the plan is a living document. You don't have to get it perfect from the get-go. If anything, the plan is the place where, especially as you complete activities and you go back and you look at your metrics, did you meet expectations? Did you fall short? How are you going to do things differently the next time? It's always changing, but you need to get it as close to perfect as possible so that you then can actually operationalize it. Go ahead, Jay. And so this is all about, of course, the theme, the visual identity and the messaging platform. So that theme needs to encompass the campaign vision. It's got to be represented in those few words. It's got to be a hook so it catches attention. It needs to serve as that thread that you get to weave through all the editorial and creative direction. Hopefully you've begun to see that we try to represent that here today in our presentation, using the theme of the launch and the countdown, et cetera, and trying to weave that throughout so it's recognizable. It's clearly tied to what you're doing. That theme has to really be authentic to your organization. It's got to be aspirational as well. After all, remember, we're headed to a new frontier. And it does need to bubble up internally. It cannot be solely an external construct. Then once you've got the theme, you can move on to the graphic identity, which needs to absolutely be on brand and ideally should be a springboard from your current organizational identity. The logo, the tagline, the visual expression. And that is important because then you are integrating across your organization. And those core messages that really emanate now from the case should be how you provide primary and secondary messages. Messages should be memorable, they should resonate, they need to carry the story through, they need to drive the calls to action. I mean, this should be all part of how you're thinking about taking the case, the foundation, and then beginning to build the rest of the messaging framework. So in this area too, we've definitely got some pitfalls. I think this first one is often the bane of most communicators, that other people think they know how to be a strategic communicator. They think they know best. They think they understand how marketing, how creative should work, etc. So that can definitely be a headache and sometimes a little bit of an obstacle. But you can definitely get around that if you make sure you're including all of the people who need a voice. But remember, they don't all get a vote. That's important. There are many people that you need to hear from, but their opinions don't necessarily need to sway ultimate decision making. And not including everything essential from the get-go can be a pitfall, because if you forget things, it's sometimes hard to wedge them back in. It's sometimes hard to remember even that you forgot them. It sometimes gets you off track. So just making sure that you get everything in there from the beginning. And again, getting distracted and losing focus. This can be a pitfall throughout the entire process. But here too, you really need to stay focused, because this is additional foundation that you're laying, and it's going to make everything you do going forward that much easier. So I think some lessons learned is, we have to remember coming up with that theme takes longer than expected. And part of that is because a lot of people want to weigh in. So it's important for you to facilitate a process to engage people, but make sure that you have a small decision-making group that can act quickly on making decisions from this point forward. And once established, really be vigilant about the consistency and the integration. After all, it's how you build awareness and trust. So don't get off course by people saying things like, well, 8 months into it, I don't really like the logo. Can you fix it? No, we're done. We're moving forward. And definitely try not to get off course, because if you're using the plan, it's going to help you get up to warp speed, to keep your momentum going, to know what actions you need to take forward to be successful. The success story I have to share with you here is an organization that I've been working with for some time. Summit Academy is an accredited nonprofit career and technical institute that serves lower income and economically challenged community here in the Twin Cities. Their mantra, and this is a great phrase, is that the best social service program in the world is a job. And so they provide free 20-week programs for in-demand careers in IT, construction, and medical administrative assistant, plus a GED program and a program for youth that helps expose them to STEM careers and helps really actually prepare them for some of those jobs in the future. So this is an organization that's been experiencing tremendous growth, lots of interest among students, but also a lot of need being expressed by employers. So they too are mounting a campaign to scale this organization for greater impact. Their theme became scaling up for greater impact. And they did a good job of sort of vetting that with the key influencers and constituents that really needed to have a say, like the board, some key donors, definitely leadership. Once the graphic identity was created for that, and a style guide was created to really help guide the use of the theme and all of the graphic elements, immediately we jumped to creating the messaging platform, which then has been used in a variety of communication elements to make sure that we're really driving forward the message and getting people excited about the campaign and then inviting them to participate. So they did a really great job of getting all the right people on board right from the get-go, and then now being very vigilant in staying true to the style guide and the graphic identity that they created. So they're off, I'm sure, to great success. Jay, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. So now we come to T-minus 6 to 12 months. This is basically the time in your campaign preparation where you are about 1 year or less away from kickoff, your campaign kickoff. So this is perhaps my favorite quote that we use throughout the presentation. I don't know who Milton Rosen is, but I can certainly empathize with his sentiment here. Everything looks easy on paper. Everything looks great when it's all written down. But when you start building out the pieces and parts that will make up your rocket, or in this case, your campaign, that's when things can go awry. So even as we've seen here in this presentation, sometimes you can plan and practice and everybody can move the slides forward in practice. And then when you get into the actual presentation, only one of you can. And so I think that's what Milton is talking about here. So this is where we take what we've put on paper and we put it into practice. Writing and editing, designing, filming, photographing. This is really the time to make all of your core ideas a reality. You start at this point in the process to develop a host of visual identity products, including things you might necessarily have thought about when you first started, but slide deck templates, business suite products of all kinds. Everything is going to have to match your graphic identity that you've come up with in the earlier parts of the progress. So this is a really important time. There's much more to do than meets the eye. You are now building the rocket. If you're still deciding on your themes or your messaging or your graphic identity, it really almost feels like it's too late. So know that there's a lot to do in this time period, a lot of writing to be done, a lot of editing, a lot of designing. Your designers and your videographers and your photographers are all going into overdrive during this time period. And you really are trying to put everything that you've agreed to into practice. You're going to try to make your thinking reality. This is the time to do that. So our focus during this time period, 6 to 12 months out from the launch of the campaign, should be creating communication vehicles in every format. And this is really a time to ensure that everything you're doing is tied together. So what does that mean? Well, any piece that you create, whether it's a printed piece or digital or video, photography, every piece has to look like it belongs and is part of the core graphic identity you've created, but also has all of the messages that you've agreed to. So when you look at your campaign, will you find your campaign messages in every case statement, in the video, on your website that you're developing? All of that has to be done now. Deadlines also take on a greater significance during this period of time. This is when the windows for completion begin to close, at least in terms of getting your printed products finished. Every piece you hope to include at your public launch has to be designed and ordered during this time period. And there are going to be things that you haven't thought about: pull-up banners, centerpieces for perhaps a dinner or a kickoff launch dinner. The list really goes on and on. What you'll find in terms of potential pitfalls during this time frame, and it sounds crazy to say this, but boredom really can come in, not in terms of getting the work done, but perhaps second thoughts, second guessing about your theme or your identity. People take a look at it, maybe they don't like the end product as much as they thought they would. So a lot of tinkering might happen here, and that at this point that can be dangerous. So I once worked with an organization where we had spent months building messaging and theme and graphic identity. We had a donor brunch, and giveaway items were made with a different theme because the campaign wasn't public yet, but people fell in love with the new theme. And then so we had to debate, do we like the new theme or the old theme? Those are the kinds of things that can happen during this time period. The other issue you might run into is overconfidence, feeling like you've got it all figured out, figuring that everything is going smoothly. This is the part, again, going back to that quote where, the motor can blow up. So it's important to build in time for things to go wrong, printing errors, coding issues, personnel changes. Build redundancy in your team as you move forward. If someone leaves, someone else needs to be able to pick up the baton. So just some things to think about as we're in that 6 to 12 month stage. So one of the lessons you can take from this time period is this is when you're going to experience the most pushback. You are instituting a lot of change in a short period of time. I mean, if you think about it, the campaign as it stands now didn't exist 6 months to a year ago. So everyone's aware the clock is ticking. You've got a date certain that you're going to launch the campaign, and everyone is aware that even though they've agreed, sometimes when they get those pieces and parts, they get nervous about it. So I worked at a place, University of South Florida, and we had a campaign theme called USF Unstoppable. And everybody loved the campaign theme. And then we started talking to athletics, and they got nervous about it because they thought, what if our opponents think that we're being braggadocious? We're saying we're unstoppable. That actually made them nervous. And it was part of our discussions and part of the work we did during this time frame to get everybody more comfortable with that. And what wound up happening is that in their uniforms, you started to see the color palette from the campaign. So not only did they buy in from just a sheer marketing and understanding, but they actually brought the color palette of the campaign into the school uniforms, so the athletics uniforms. So a lot can happen here. There can be a lot of successes, but don't be surprised if you get some pushback. And don't panic. You're going to get pushback. I think the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is right. If you change course now, you're doomed. So don't panic. Expect some pushback, but know that good things can come out of that. And people can grow and get excited about what you're doing during this time frame. So the last T-minus is 0 to 6 months out. And when I thought about what it's like on the ground working in a campaign with less than 6 months to go until launch, I was reminded of one of my favorite movies in the last several years, which is Hidden Figures. And there's a scene in Hidden Figures where the astronauts are gathered around and everybody's having to sit at the table and say, are we ready to launch? Are we ready to really give this a shot? Are we ready to go into space? And the characters, John Glenn, the astronaut, says, well, if Catherine says the numbers are good, then I'm good to go. So the underlying question over this time is, are the numbers good? So now is the time to double check everything. The last few months are all about finishing, but not simply getting done and checking boxes. It really goes much deeper than that. Getting the job done right is still more important than getting it done fast. You're going to feel a lot of time pressure during this 6-month window. But even if some things have to be delayed, even if some things have to be not launched with a regular launch, it's worth doing that to make sure they're done right. So keep that in mind. Don't get so caught up in we have to have everything ready to go at the launch. Sometimes things will go wrong. Sometimes you need to rethink things. So just make sure it gets done right and really be concentrating on your core messaging, your graphic identity, all those things you've agreed to. Now it's the time to double check everything and finish. It should really be your focus now. Is the graphic identity correctly represented everywhere? If you take all of your printed publications and put them on a table, do they look like they belong to the same family? Do they look the same as your website? Do the video cryon graphics on your video match? Can you find your core messages in every piece and on every platform? And does the photography and videography that you're doing convey the themes and messages of the campaign? This is your last chance to get it right. Be mindful of what it is you hope to accomplish at every step of the process. And if this was an actual rocket launch, this would be the last chance for a real life scrub or reschedule. But it's highly unlikely that in our case, you'll be able to do so. So again, go back to those questions. Is the graphic identity correctly represented everywhere? Can you find your core messages in every piece and on every platform? And does the videography and photography accurately convey the themes and messages of the campaign? The visual identity is just as important and probably more important in today's times than the written word. So there are some potential pitfalls that can happen 6 months out, 3 months out, 2 weeks out from the launch of your campaign. Leadership changes are the biggest of these, either for the organization as a whole or at the unit level. If you're at a university and you've got a college that's changing deans and has a different vision for the college than what you've already put on paper or already put on the website or already shot in the video. All this can be incredibly challenging as you're right up against the deadline. If the launch is scrubbed, and by this I mean the actual campaign launch, is almost always because of a change in leadership. But successful operations can triage quickly and correct mistakes or make changes, reevaluate all their options as necessary. This is a time to be ready, to be finishing, but also to be nimble. And if you do have leadership changes, then being nimble and making changes on the fly and what you're working on will be really important. So those are some of the potential pitfalls that I personally run across in doing this kind of work. So, lessons learned. Boy, one big lesson is you have to script your event early. Don't wait to the last minute. Don't wait to the last week. Be thinking about how you're going to incorporate your core messaging into the script of your launch event. Who is going to say what? How are they going to convey those messages? Really important. If you are a nonprofit, make sure you have people that benefit from your work speaking at your event. If you're a college or university, make sure that people that benefit from the fundraising, whether it's scholarship students or faculty, are able to speak at your event. You want to include the beneficiaries as much as the donors, as much as the leadership in the scripting for the event. Work closely with your events team. Maybe some of you are the events team. Maybe you have separate events teams. Either way, make sure that there's a continuity of graphic identity and messaging in the event itself. Right down to the smallest details. Can you get napkins that match the colors in your launch or in your campaign? Wonderful. Do so. No detail is too small when you are trying to build a graphic identity. And this, remember, is really the first time that your core audiences are going to see what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. So no detail is too small. Work really closely with your events team. I think there's probably no greater feeling, and if you've worked on a team that's gone through and launched a campaign, there's no greater feeling than the day after, or maybe that same night after the event, and knowing that it's gone well, knowing that you've conveyed the right messages, that you've represented the graphic identity correctly, and that you've started something really, truly special. When you have that feeling, when you know you've done that, there's really nothing quite like it in a professional sense. So I'm happy to say that I've worked in a couple of places where we've been able to have that feeling. We're working with clients today where we're helping them get to that feeling, because really there's nothing quite like it. But be sure you check everything, be sure you script early, and be sure you and your events team are on the same page. Okay, lift off to splashdown. So this is where really you do most of your work in communications. It's funny, we talk a lot about everything that we've done up to now, but really your time to shine is now. Post-launch, during the public phase of the campaign, the underlying question here is, are you ready to throttle up? I love Alan Shepard's quote, by the way. All he had to do is survive the reentry forces. Well, you've launched, and perhaps you're now in outer space, but you've got to go through your orbits, and then you have to be able to land. And momentum cannot be taken for granted. So, maintaining momentum after a successful campaign launch is vital to the success of your campaign. I would argue that your first meeting on momentum with your communications team, your donor relations team, if they're one and the same, having a meeting just with yourselves, your events team, everybody should be on board to start talking about how do we maintain and grow momentum after the launch of a campaign. Cannot be taken for granted. I think it's easy to forget that your audience's attention spans are short. They are not living the campaign day in, day out the way you will be and the way you have been for many months. So the really hard work is ahead of you. So again, this is the most important time for communications and marketing in a campaign. It's the most exciting time. It's really your chance to shine. So the focus during this time frame, the public phase, is maintaining momentum. Your job as communicators is to build on the moment in time when the campaign is launched. Our colleagues in fundraising often talk about going public with 70% perhaps of the campaign raised and 30% left to achieve. As communications professionals, we should flip these numbers in our head. We've really done about 30% of the work, and 70% is still to come. We're not even halfway to where we need to be in communicating our campaign messaging. So the real work begins now. So how do you plan to keep awareness and engagement strong 3 weeks after launch, 3 months after launch, 3 years after launch? Public campaigns can be long, so we have to be ready with a plan that is going to carry us through the entirety of the campaign. There are 4 questions that as you roll out of bed every morning, you should be asking yourself. First, who am I trying to reach? Second, how often should I be reaching them? Third, how should I reach them? And the answer is going to be different for each audience. And finally, what do they need to know? And this one may be the most important question of them all. Thinking about what I want to tell them, what stories I need to tell. This is when we start telling our stories of the campaign and the beneficiaries and who is impacted and why it's important. How should I get those stories to them? What's the best way to reach them? Is it social media? Is it email? Is it the website, video, some combination, all of the above? How often should I reach them? Quarterly, monthly, on the daily and social media? And who am I trying to reach? General public, high net worth individuals, everybody in between? Important questions to ask yourself every day and have answers when you go into work. So some potential pitfalls during the public phase of the campaign. I've said it before, it's worth repeating. Campaigns are long. It's really easy to get distracted. You're going to be living your campaign theme, your campaign core messages, your campaign graphic identity day in and day out for years. But your audiences are not. They are not going to feel as tired of your campaign as your colleagues are. They're not going to be as bored at some point with your messaging as your colleagues might be. For many of them, the first time they see it will be just as revelatory as it was the first time you came up with it. And you have to remember that. It's really, really important not to give in to the temptation to make changes halfway through because you're just tired yourself, or maybe the CEO is tired, or maybe the head of development is tired of the messaging. The messaging is there because it's powerful. The graphic identity is there because it conveys what the message is trying to say in a visual way. And the stories you tell are important because they showcase what your operation or your university or your nonprofit is doing in the communities you serve. It's easy to forget that. it's important not to. So, lessons learned during this time. Now's the time to stretch out of your comfort zone, try new things, be creative, be innovative, use video, use social, use digital. All of these ways of communicating should be at the forefront of your thinking. As much as it pains me to say, as a longtime writer, video is the way to go, digital is the way to go. Short bursts, short attention spans, reach your audiences where they live. Campaigns create incredible opportunities for powerful storytelling. You've got to be mindful of how philanthropy is changing your organization and the communities you serve for the better. Tell those stories in every conceivable way you can. Every day and every platform is providing you a golden opportunity to tell those stories. Think about ways to tell the same story in different ways to different audiences, especially if it speaks to the core messages that you created way back in the beginning of your process. And when you splash down, a lot of times when we end a campaign, we think our role as storytellers and as communicators is effectively at an end. And in a way it is, but not before you tell the story of the impact of the campaign. It's really important, once the campaign is coming to a close, that you're able to come up with ways to show your audiences, your publics, what the campaign really achieved for the communities you serve. And if you're successful, and great organizations are, the leadership will be using your messaging for years after the campaign. You're going to have buy-in from board members. They'll be able to talk about your campaign in elevator speeches, but also in front of their own publics. And most importantly, in some ways, the internal dynamics of your organization will change over the course of the public phase of the campaign. We often talk about a culture of philanthropy, and it's really based in internal communications. And if people are talking the message of the campaign internally and externally, you'll build that culture of philanthropy within your organization, and everybody will be on the same page. And I think with that, Carol,
Yes.
we have another survey.
Yes, we do have another survey. And so Lauren, please tee it up for us. And if you would all just take a minute to make your selection here. How are you feeling about your campaign communications planning now? Are you ready to dream, prepare for launch, be in orbit, make re-entry? All right, looks like lots of people are in those two early stages, which is very exciting. That's an exciting place to be at.
All right. Let's
All
see
right.
where we are. All right. Look, yeah, right. It looks like everybody is dreaming or preparing for launch.
Yep, which is great. Yep, we certainly have a lot of clients we're working with in those exact same spaces. All right. Well, we'd love to hear any questions any of you might have. Okay, yes, you will be getting a copy of the presentation. It's a great question. Thank you for saying that. So I remember to share that information. We'll follow up with that. This has been recorded, so that will also be available. We did get a couple questions in advance, so I'm going to share those, and maybe that'll prompt some of you to think of some things. Jay, here's a question for you. I'll lob this one to you. Can we begin messaging before the launch?
Absolutely, you should begin messaging before the launch, but you don't have to say the name of your campaign. But if you develop those core messages, if you can start weaving them into documents you're creating or videos you're shooting, it's really important to do so. Start getting the ground ready for what you're going to try to convey during the campaign. I would absolutely begin the messaging process well before launch.
Yes, I would completely agree with that. Again, you can almost never start too soon. Here's a question. Campaign goals are often huge, and this is all in caps, which I completely agree with. Any advice on making it relevant for an annual giving level audience? Jay, why don't you take that one and I'll grab the next one that I'm just reading here.
All right. So yes, I think annual giving audiences you have to combine your campaign messaging with your annual giving messaging. They should be reflective of each other. If you've got campaign messaging that reflects the aspirations of your organization, then I would think that donors at every level would want to hear and understand what you're trying to accomplish. And I would have no hesitations about taking that same messaging to every level of donor.
I've got two here that are similar, so I'll read them both and then we'll take a stab at answering these. So when should the campaign plan start? And how do you develop a communications plan for a public launch when the launch date is dependent on a lead gift and there's no anticipated timeline for securing that gift? So great questions. I definitely, in working with clients, have found that it's really helpful to begin the campaign planning process very early and develop the plan and have it actually include those early phases that we talked about. So when are you going to begin work on the theme? When, have the case. So when are you going to have the case finalized? When are you going to develop the theme? When are you going to get the graphic identity? Have all of those steps reflected there too, because it's all part of the really vital work that you're doing, and get all of that laid out in the plan. It guides your work, and it's important for colleagues to, I think, see all the steps that you need to take before you're ready to respond to the one thing they're waiting for you to do. So I think it's an important thing to share with certainly the rest of the fundraising team, just to make sure everyone's aware of all the moving parts that you're responsible for. The public launch, you're absolutely right. If we're aiming to have, 70, even sometimes 75% of the total goal before we go to launch, then it's hard to guesstimate when that's going to be. But in campaign planning, certainly on the fundraising side, I know that when we prepare campaign plans, we have a guesstimate of when that's going to happen based on analytics that we do for our clients. And so the plan can be built. And remember, I said early on, it's a living document. So things may need to be adjusted 3-4 years into it if campaign goals aren't being hit, the fundraising goals aren't being hit. So again, I think you put it together with the best information you have at the beginning, and then make adjustments as you need to going forward. But I would absolutely lean on the fundraising team, who most likely is working with outside counsel, to give you some sense of what they are targeting for the leadership phase versus the public phase. All right, so another question here. How does the private phase fit into the planning process? Or is this referring only to the public phase? I'm going to start answering this, and then Jay, I'll have you weigh in as well. So certainly today we've been talking about what needs to happen up to the public launch. But when you're developing that case, the core messaging, the messaging platform, even the identity and the campaign plan, the communications plan, that absolutely includes that private leadership phase. And there are materials that the gift officers are going to need as they're meeting with some of these leadership donors. And so you need to include in your communication plan those elements that are going to be important communication touch points for those leadership gift prospective donors. So the plan absolutely has to include the entire life of the campaign, not just what's going to happen on the day you let the public know that you're working on a campaign.
Absolutely. We're working with colleges and universities now, and I see Pauline's got a follow up the timing of that for the private phase. I'm working right now with a college that is probably 4 years out from a public launch. And we've developed the core messaging already. We've developed the graphic identity. We've put together what we're calling leadership case statements for programs that they're focusing on during the leadership phase. So and we've developed a website for them that isn't a campaign website, but it contains the messaging that the campaign will be built on. So it doesn't have like the campaign name on it, the campaign theme, but it does have the graphic identity and it does represent those core messages. That's really the big difference in my mind between the public phase and the leadership phase. The messaging is the same. And if you're developing platforms, the graphic identity is the same, but what changes is that you then talk more explicitly about the theme of the campaign. So
I know that projects I've worked on, when you look at the campaign plan, I would say in general that the leadership phase, the private phase, is actually the majority of the timeline. Because, you know, again, you're trying to get to 70-75% of the goal. And depending on, you know, your prospects, your potential in the pipeline, the portfolios, et cetera, all these things are going to bear on how long it's going to take you to get to that phase. And then that public phase is, it looks shorter, although it can certainly be, you know, 2-3 years long. But in general, in terms of the timing, it's a little bit longer. Another question here, are you seeing old school regional rollouts, public events, or the public phase of campaigns?
we're starting to again, aren't we?
A little.
Yeah, obviously
little
with the pandemic, they stopped for a while, but we're starting to see these public events again, and some are regional and some are just on campus. But yes, and alumni events that are part of campaign momentum. Absolutely, we're starting to see all of that coming back.
Yeah, and I think many too are now, they're often smaller in scale. They're sometimes hybrid, so they can have lots of people participating from disparate geographic locations. I think people are really rethinking how to make these events meaningful and memorable. So some new thinking definitely has come as a result of the pandemic. Another question, can you share some sample campaign communications plans or templates? And I would say certainly, Pamela, if you want to reach out to us, one of us can maybe share some ideas or some references that we use. So feel free to reach out to us. We're going to make a slide available here shortly where you can get our direct contact information.
Right.
Well, I'm mindful that we're just a few minutes out. Jay, if you can go to the next slide, please.
Great questions, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Really engaging questions. Appreciate it very much.
The QR code. So please feel free to provide us feedback on today's webinar. You can just use the QR code right there on your screen. Give everybody a minute. We would love to hear back from you.
We've also put a URL into the chat so that you could just grab that if that's easier for you to do.
And if you'd like to reach out to us directly, these are the best ways to do it. We'd love to hear from you. Absolutely.
Thank you all so much for being here today. We definitely appreciate having you with us. And we will be in touch following up after this webinar. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. We appreciate your time today.